But the big risk of these raw foods isn't really to the animals, it's to their owners, because of the difference between them.
Hello and welcome to the Pet Food Science Podcast, where our goal is to share research findings to help support the continual innovation in the pet food and nutrition industry. I'm your host, Dr. Kate Shoveler, and I'm here today with our guest, Dr. Keith Warriner from the University of Guelph in the Department of Food Science. Keith, thanks for being with us today.
Oh, thanks for the invitation.
Today, we're going to talk about food quality and safety with Dr. Warriner, and we're going to really dive deep into new technologies that you might consider applying to make sure that you sustain your food quality. Keith Warriner returned to the University of Guelph to study food science after training and working as a chef in the United Kingdom. After completing his PhD, he worked for the Department of Medicine at the University of Manchester, studying biosensors, and at the University of Nottingham as a research fellow in food microbiology, working with fresh produce. Keith joined the Department of Food Science at the University of Guelph in 2002 and was promoted to full professor in 2011. I've most recently started working with Keith on the development of some new and emerging pet food opportunities here at the University of Guelph for undergraduate students and greatly look forward to our interactions there. Keith, would you mind telling us a little bit more about your journey in terms of research?
Yeah, it certainly was a long journey, starting as a chef when I actually was leaving school because I didn't know what to do, like most people in life. And I spent about 4 years in industry for that. And I went to the University of Nottingham I went to the Grimsby College of Higher Education first to get food science. I went to University of Nottingham to do a degree. Then I went to the University of Aberystwyth to actually switch gears completely. I was doing microbial physiology, which is a shame because now's the physiology time, with the precision fermentation. Then, as you rightly said, I switched gears again to look at diagnostics, blood glucose sensors and things like that, and alcohol sensors in the University of Manchester before going to food science in University of Nottingham, where we kind of researched into the fundamentals of an innovation technique, which we'll probably talk about later, the hydroxyradical process, and also fresh produce safety. And in 2002, I think it was, I came over to the University of Guelph. I realised where Guelph was only when I was coming for the interview. I didn't know it was in the where we are today. But anyway, so I came over here and we started a research group really extending from what we did at the University of Nottingham, specifically fresh produce safety. So fresh produce is still responsible for the most number of outbreaks. When we get big outbreaks, like with lettuce, and back then it was cantaloupes and tomatoes, and they're coming back. What we were looking at is the interaction of pathogens with plants. But also, more importantly, which was a diversion from the normal research, which was how do we make the process the vegetables and fruit and vegetables safer through decontamination technologies. Well, we knew washing doesn't do anything, and it's quite interesting. There was an outbreak in Sweden, I think it was, linked to bag salad, and they suddenly realized, oh yes, washing doesn't do anything. So long story short, we were looking at a new process, and we didn't call it hydroxyradical process then. We called it AOP, or hydrogen peroxide in UV, which we'll refer to. And this was a novel technique, and we started research on that in 2002, and it progressed. And then we actually came across an instance with listeria and candy apples, of all things. And the person who was responsible for not responsible for the outbreak, but saw their market collapse, because in that outbreak, I think it was 2015, there was about 26 cases of listeria, and it was really centered around the California producer of candy apples. And long story short, they basically were using drop apples. They put them in the dunk water. Listeria was there, spread all around. And obviously with candy apples, you put your stick in, driving it into the center where the listeria grow, 26 cases. And basically, retailers just didn't want to know about candy apples anymore because of the risk. Anyway, so a candy apple producer from Niagara, I won't say the name because I don't want to make sure we implicate, um, came to me saying, look, we need a method for decontaminating these candy apples, because retailers won't want to take the risk anymore. And his idea was, let's use UV. And I said, no, UV alone isn't good because it's only hits what it sees. So what we did is I introduced him to this research we did back in 2002, 2006, which was a hydroxy radical process. And long story short, from that point, we applied it to his candy apple production, and retailers fell over themselves to buy his apples, grew 10 times. And this is the power of having those risk management strategies. If you can reassure the retailers saying, look, we've got a safe product, your business is really going to expand, which it did. Anyway, to the point where I'm trying to get to is that he actually developed a company or set up a company with Court Holdings called CleanWorks. And from those, for the last, I would say 5 years, 6 years, it's really expanded. And it's even expanded into the raw pet food, which we did a trial for last year when a company approached, I won't say which company again, and it works. And so it was a good intervention and kind of introduces this sort of pet feed arena, if you want to call it that. But we've done lots of different things, and other research we've done is risk assessment or risk of emerging pathogens, Clostridium difficile, sugar toxin E. coli, things like that. So really, if you want to sum up how we stirred the research, well, I think events outside steered our research in that we were addressing real problems, be it cantaloupes, be it tomatoes, be it sprouts, be it the emerging of non-0157 E. coli. And so that's where we kind of we emigrate to the problems that the industry have.
As the world is looking for healthier, more natural, and sustainable solutions, InnovaFeed's Helucia protein and oil for pets offers a path to a brighter future for pet food. Helucia represents the convergence of the natural upcycling power of Hermetia illucens larvae with InnovaFeed's cutting-edge production technology to produce the highest quality ingredients for pet nutrition with the lowest environmental footprint. Helucia protein and oil for pets has been meticulously developed, tested, and validated to deliver outstanding digestibility and palatability in both dry and wet pet food formulation, while environmental impacts have been validated through a published life cycle assessment. Learn more at innovafeed.com/Helucia.
Fantastic. And it's really, you really impress upon me the importance of having all the key opinion leaders at the table. And I suggested this to you before we started the podcast as well, but I tell my students in nutrition all the time that we can do a really great formula, but if we don't have food scientists on board for a myriad of different reasons, whether that's nutritional quality or food safety, then we really are missing the mark in terms of consumer demand. And so I think it's really interesting how you've taken a lot of the technologies that you were applying to human food and now thinking about pet food. And of course, we have a lot more pets in our houses these days. So it makes quite a bit of sense for pet food to have the same considerations as human food, as the United States government has done with the Food Safety Modernization Act and bringing pet food under that. But can you talk a little bit maybe about why and what we should be concerned about between the different and most common formats of feeding pets, which would be extruded food, canned food, and raw food? What are the biggest risks to those three?
Yeah, that's a very good question, isn't it? Because back in the day, we used to feed our sort of dogs and cats canned food almost exclusively. And canning is useful, because it literally commercially sterilizes the product. No food safety risks. I think what's really happened is when we started getting into the kibble aspect, and who could forget the melamine sort of cases, the excess vitamin D in some cases. But really what happens is that with kibble, they do extrusion. So this extrusion is high pressure steam, and it heats it up and it extrudes it, and it's fairly safe. But after saying that, there was an interesting case when I first arrived in Canada. I think it was about 2006 when I actually went to a pet food facility, and what they were having issues with is these salmonella hits. So kibble, the usually extrusion process, good. You kill off your salmonella. You have to kind of validate it, though. It's not as straightforward as you think. But anyway, to the point is that in this case, what was happening is that they switched suppliers of this flavoring, and as you know, obviously the audience know as well about kibble, you extrude it and then you put the coating on which contains the flavors and all this kind of thing. Anyway, so what happened is that they had to switch suppliers for this flavoring agent, and they were bringing it in and they were spraying it onto the kibble, and they were getting salmonella hit after salmonella hit. And what was happening is that every time they got a salmonella hit, their first instance was sanitize everything. So they got the water out, which is always not good in a dry, moisture environment. And they were getting even more hits. And they brought me in, because usually I come into a crisis. I don't usually come in when it's simple. And what we found was that their maintenance had slipped, and they had a crack in one of the delivery pipes. And every time they were spraying water, they were adding water to the dry ingredient. And you know what happens when you get water and dry ingredients together? You get a nice growth for pathogens such as salmonella. And, essentially, we solved that issue for them. But I think that reflects on something we might talk about later, is that even though we consider pet food as, well, don't worry, animals don't get salmonella, even though it's not true, and all this, they have a very different view to food, human food processes. And you refer to the FSMA, which really was a shock to the industry, because you could imagine these pet food suppliers, suddenly realizing, saying, what, we have to produce the same standard as human food. And when you go into FSMA, if you're new to the food safety game and you go into FSMA, the FSMA turned everything upside down from what people understood before. It was totally confusing. So no wonder the poor sort of providers were all confused and things like that. But so kibble, though, going back to the question, I suppose, kibble is fairly safe. It's heat treated. As long as your things are your flavorings and nutrition supplements are good to coat it, you're fine. Not many cases, although there have been cases. Where the real thing happens, obviously, is the raw pet food trend. So with raw pet food, they were basically, you've got products that can support the growth of pathogens like salmonella. You've got products that are contaminated with salmonella. And so this is where the big risk starts coming. Because if you produce food, not under the food safety management systems, like in the case of the US, the FSMA, in the case of Canada, the Safe Food for Canadians Act. And it's interesting, the differentiation between the Canada and the US, which we'll talk about a bit later. You're going to start from scratch, because you are producing food from which has high risk to it, poultry being the main one, obviously. And the thing is this concept that, well, animals are used to it. Animals don't get salmonella. But I think, personally, I think animals are good at protecting themselves in terms of, people gripe and groan when they've got foodborne illness. Animals totally different. They try to make out they're not ill. And the other thing about it is that they can get ill, but they're more robust to it, obviously. But the big risk of these raw foods isn't really to the animals. It's to their owners, because of the difference between them. And I know, looking at the sort of press articles and numerous YouTube videos and things like that, how sort of confrontational things are, in that you got one sort of side saying, we should, sterile food is bad, high pressure processed food is bad. And then you got the other side, obviously the regulators, saying, well, you're going to cause salmonella cases for the pet owners. And it's very reminiscent of the raw milk debate, because I was involved in a major court case a few years ago. where they were trying to reintroduce raw milk within Canada, Ontario especially. And the arguments were the same, saying you're taking all the good bacteria out of raw milk and consumer choice and that. And it was quite interesting. The same kind of debate seems to be with the pet food industry. But so obviously the landscape has changed because we have got more raw pet food. And with that raw pet food comes the risks for sure.
Yeah, so would you like to go a little bit into, and I would like to understand a little bit more too, what you would implement if you were making raw food? Because I understand that there's risks and a lot of the consumers do too, but I think you and I also appreciate that we can tell people or try to control the safety of the food that they eat, but it is the consumer's choice. And if we do not provide them what they want, they will go elsewhere looking for it. So if you were going to consult on a raw pet food basis, what kind of hazard protocols would you put in the manufacturing process?
Yeah, it is quite interesting. Going back to the raw milk, I won't dwell on it, but it's the same kind of argument, saying it's the public's right, it's my right, and even religious right to drink raw milk. But sometimes you've got to protect consumers from themselves. But so there's a happy medium, though. The reality is that we know that certain raw fed food, especially the ones with meat and poultry, will likely harbour pathogens. And people say raw diets are good. That's a nutritionist like yourself to to say yes or no. But there are ways of doing things. And the first thing you've got to do in the industry, and I agree with the US, to be honest, in this one, is that with FSMA, they basically encompass animal food with human food. In Canada, as you're probably aware, we kind of say, well, yeah, food for farm animals have a standard. Food for pets, don't worry about it. We don't really care, what you do. So, but the reality is that you do need to protect not only pets but their owners. And essentially, what they need to kind of do is get these what we call food safety management systems in place. So I'll go to the US first, even though they're kind of confusing. So in the US, under FSMA, you need to have a food safety plan. And if you're new to the game and of basically complying with these sort of food safety plan, it's a very challenging because what the food safety management system is every aspect of your process, from how it's designed, how the flow of waste goes, how the flow of workers go, how you monitor, how you identify the hazards, how you look at how to prevent those hazards and mitigate those hazards. So we did some other research a few years ago, well, last year to be honest, where we developed this food safety toolkit with the in collaboration with United Nations FAO, and you can find it online. It's basically Food Safety Toolkit FAO, and what this does is kind of approach the food safety management in a different way. So before, or even currently, the basically strategy to, I'll call it educate the industry, which isn't a good word, but I'll just say it to help. Educate the industry is say, right, we're going to write these guidelines down, which are what we call prescriptive, saying you do this, you do that. And it doesn't work because the industry is so diverse. Basically one pet food process will be very different to another. So with this food safety toolkit, what we do is we kind of take the user on a journey. And this journey is their journey of learning. And we are aware that everyone learns differently. So what we try to do is map it out, saying go from A to B, basic, well, maybe, for example, facility construction. So we say we go facility construction, we've got an element to it. So we go to that point. Then we give them the key points saying, look, you need to know this minimum. But then we expand it to this more in-depth sort of description of what they should be doing. And another thing we do is learn by asking. So I guess in your classes, like I do in my classes, I ask the class to ask a question. What question? Not So you don't give them an answer. You say, well, you tell me a question, because it's a question that's more important than the answer sometimes. So we do this by learn by asking. So what happens is that it tells you what questions to ask. If you don't know it, you know somebody who does, like, a consultant or someone like that. So the first thing you need to do, I think personally, to get back to your question, is look at the food safety toolkit, get that background, because it's from a primary source, the FAO. It's from the Codex General Principle of Hygienic Practice. And if you like, this is the foundation reference for most of the regulations we see today. And a bit like everything else, when you get regulators like FDA, CFIA, they kind of interpret the Codex GHP. But if you go to and some do it good, some do it not so good. But if you go to the original source and you've got confidence saying, yeah, this is what I need to know. So if you are setting up a business or in business, I would suggest certainly go to the FAO full safety toolbox and just get a bit of knowledge, because it's a knowledge to learning where you can use that knowledge in the context of your own operation. So that's one aspect. So the other aspect, which I guess we come on to, which we referred to before, is you need some sort of intervention method. Basically, you've got to accept that raw pet food, especially if it contains things like chicken, is going to have pathogens. We all know salmonella is with chicken. 20% of the chicken we buy in the shop has salmonella. 13% has Campylobacter. That's the reality of life. And I noticed, some pushback from the pet food industry saying, you allow standards here, but in the food industry, in the pet food sector, we have zero tolerance. So it's all right to get salmonella in chicken going to human food, but it's not all right for the pet food people. But obviously the big difference is that, well, we don't expect the average person to buy chicken and eat it raw, even though there is a restaurant in Toronto that does that. So there's that discount. But what we can do is apply non-thermal intervention methods. So we can't cook it, because then it becomes cooked pet food, not raw pet food. And the industry have tried a few things, and I've noticed a few bit of disinformation on certain videos. I won't say which doctor it was, but I don't want to embarrass them. But for example, high pressure processing has been kind of put forward to it, and what high pressure does is basically apply around about 600 megapascals. So if you want an example of that, and it's not a good example, but I'll give it and you can see what you want to do with it, it's around about 10 to 15 times the pressure than the Titanic sitting at the bottom of the sea. And we all know what happened there. So it's a really high pressure. And what it does is basically squeeze the life out of microbes. It basically disassembles them. But it's a pasteurization method. It's not a sterilization method. And also, it's not very good for dry ingredients, because what happens is that the drier the ingredient, the less high pressure does things. The more neutral the pH, the less pressure does things. So high pressure is very expensive. If you buy a unit, you're looking $1 million minimum. A lot of people use tolling facilities, so we'd have to pack the product up in vacuum packs, send it to a facility, send it back again, and by the time it's come back, you've got a few days shelf life less, isn't it? Because obviously you're transporting it. So the other thing is irradiation. So irradiation, not really fancied by anybody, for the simple reason it's costly. Again, you have to send it to a facility, send it back again. It can develop odors to the product, and you have to have a label saying irradiated, irradiation sticker. And, people's talked about UV, again, not very good. UVC kills what it sees, and on even a chicken surface, it's very shaded, so the salmonella can hide away. And with ozone, again, it's very unstable, and it doesn't work that well, for the simple reason, once it hits the chicken, it just gives the ghost stuff and neutralizes. So what we need to do is develop a method which is more convenient, much more compatible with the flow pattern of a facility, where you can do it within the facility and it's effective. Which brings me on to our process, which is called gas phase hydroxyradical process. And essentially, to describe it, it's basically taking hydrogen peroxide mist, ozone gas, which is degraded by UV lamps, all in a chamber. Now, in nature, we see this in the clouds. So what happens in the clouds, in the sky, is that we get solar radiation, we get ozone up there. I know we talk about the ozone layer and ozone holes and that, but the ozone layer is there. The sun hits the ozone and it produces these hydroxy radicals, which some suggest, reduce the pollution, which we cause by cars and industry and things like that. So we've basically taken that concept and put it into a chamber. And the hydroxy radicals are very quick acting, and they basically inactivate the microbe and then just dissipate to water and oxygen. So, I'm not claiming to be the first person to actually discover this. Obviously, Henry Fenton back in 1890s was, but more recently, I'm talking 40 years, so it's not recent at all. They've used the UV hydrogen peroxide to sterilize cartons, for aseptic drink, Elopack system. So it's not new. It's just new to food. Anyway, long story short then. So what this process does is that it introduces hydrogen peroxide mist, ozone gas, UV, and we get about a 2 to 3 log reduction of salmonella on the surface of poultry. Critics would say, well, salmonella gets inside the lymphatic nodes and inside. Yeah, it does, but, the surface contamination, I think, still most significant. So we tried that. We've done it on lots of different produce, and during the pandemic even, we did it on N95 masks, so we could sterilize an N95 mask, for endospores inactivation within 30 seconds. Whereas, so to the point then is that we've done trials with pet food. It was quite unexpected in terms of how we got into this, because usually what happens is that we're looking for processes that we can apply it. And a raw pet food company approached us and says, could you decontaminate my frozen pet food, fish, bone, chicken feet of all things? Yeah, no problem. And we put it in frozen because it's so quick, it comes out frozen as well. So you don't get defrosting or anything like that. So to answer your original question, because I think I'm going off at a tangent now, is that what they have to do is they've got to get a food safety manager. There's no point in putting high pressure in. There's no point in putting irradiation or even our process in if your facility's not running right. And I think if you are, and I assume, a lot of companies that were in kibble are transferring now to raw pet food, and you've got a very different risk profile between the two. So that's would be my advice of what should happen. And as I said, I think the US with FSMA and the FDA are usually criticised a lot, and for good reason. But I think the FDA are right in this place. Is that let's reduce the risk from raw pet food. And I think in Canada, we should be doing the same, to be honest. But that's another point of view.
Yeah, I think that maybe on a Canadian perspective, one of the reasons that we don't see is much oversight by the government is I think more than 50% of our market is actually imported from the United States. So by default, we're taking advantage of their regulations for our pet food safety for at least half of that market. But the other thing I wanted to point out too, I do believe I'm correct in this, that we cannot irradiate cat foods. There's something that happens after the irradiation procedure that cats react to, and I've long forgotten. Are you aware of this as well?
Yeah, I'm aware of the byproducts. I'm not specifically aware of cats being affected by it, but you're exactly right and bring up a very good point. And in the US, although the FDA are doing good, we still get outbreaks and people recalls in Canada. And it's a good point you make, because what people think is that, okay, let's take products from the human food side, and I'll give you irradiation's one, and you're exactly right. If you overdose irradiation, you get these byproducts formed, and these byproducts actually cause what we call a wet dog odor. And the free radicals, I can understand what you're talking about in that. And this was a problem with irradiation. It called it grey meat because it turns the meat grey as well if you overdose it. So you need low dose. But to another sort of, reminding me of another intervention where people use peracetic acid. So peracetic acid is a combination of acetic acid and hydrogen peroxide. The belief is, it breaks down to acetic acid and peroxide, no problem. But the reality is it too produces byproducts. And there was a company in the US who was applying this without notifying the FDA. And they said, you can't do that because the byproducts from these processes might not harm humans, but they can be dangerous to animals. And you've got to prove that it's not. And I think that's what processes have to be wary of as well. And the good thing about the hydroxy radical process is that it leaves no residues and no byproducts. And Health Canada consider it a processing aid for that reason. But you're exactly right. You've got to be careful. Not so much the customers, because they're just hoping that the producers are doing the right thing. But producers have to be aware, saying, yes, there is similarities, but you've got to be aware of what the risks are for sure.
So interesting. You said that the hydroxy radical process is considered a processing aid. So maybe for the listeners, if you could describe what that means in terms of how you label your product. So is that included anywhere on the ingredient deck? Is it conveyed anywhere on the package? What the process is to gain the microbial stability?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So basically, when you've got a novel process, you've got to go to Health Canada and then the USDA, the FDA. They don't approve anything. They give you no objection letters. So say, for example, we had a process which extended the shelf life of foods. So it must do that by obviously changing the product in some way. And things like peracetic acid is a good example of it, even though it's grass and that. So when you get a novel food designation, you have to kind of prove what residues there are not toxic. It functions. You don't just use it for the sake of it. It actually functions in what it does, and it's safe. And so you have to go through a market assessment, and you get the market assessment saying, yep, that process is good, or no, it's not. Now, the other avenue is a processing aid. So with a processing aid, as the name suggests, it aids processing. So, for example, it'll do the job, inactivate salmonella, but it'll leave no residues or any lasting effect. So essentially, from that, you don't need to put it as an ingredient. Because the simple reason is nothing there. It comes and it's gone. So you don't need to label it. And the thing is if you do treat it with this, the hydroxy radical process, you've got to pack it. It doesn't extend the shelf life per se, apart from reducing a bit of the microflora. Because if you put salmonella on it again, it'll just grow. So that's the difference between a processing aid and an additive. An additive has to be listed. It's got a lasting effect, whereas a processing aid has no effect apart from the function of, for example, decontaminating salmonella. Doesn't have to appear on the label or anything like that.
Great. And then have any of the tests, so you already alluded to that with species specific information. Have there been any attempts to feed these raw food products to cats and or dogs that have been exposed to the hydroxy radical process?
Well, I must admit, my cats are very kibble focused, so they're not getting the trend of raw food. We haven't. Basically, it needs to be done for sure. To see the acceptability in that. From what we see, when we've done our trials, it looks good to us and things like that. There's no peroxide residues or anything of that nature, but it's certainly in an early stage. It's a kind of new avenue because our kind of major avenues at the moment is fresh produce, hatchery eggs, and things like this. But certainly, if we can make people aware of the technology, then hopefully, we can get these studies moving, because obviously we have to think about, as you rightly said, acceptance. Is there something about this product that's been hydroxy-radical process that put people off. Certainly in the human food side, there's nothing we can detect. We've taken it's commercialized and that, but yeah, with animals, it's you've got to prove it. You've got to say there's nothing there that would put animals off or anything like that.
Interesting. Okay, well, maybe a shameless shout out here, because most of the work that's done with pet food has to be supported by the pet food industry, because there's very few, either in Canada would be provincial, in the US state, or federal granting agencies that support pet food work beyond some basic connections to human food safety. So we would have to make that connection, which it would be there too. But this sounds like a fantastic avenue for the pet food industry to consider, and to consider funding. The other part prior to feeding to animals is, does the application of the hydroxy radical process to raw pet food change the nutrient content of the pet food at all?
That's a really good question. So we have, like I say, with pet food, we haven't delved deeper because, as you rightly said, it's for industry to take the lead, and but I think they'll see benefits. Like people will be willing to buy like the candy apple example. Retailers will be much more satisfied with life. Regulators will be a bit more happier and things like that. So when we have done treatments with the hydroxy radical process, one of the parts of getting a processing aid designation is you don't change the nutrients. And so we've done this on mushrooms of all things, and there's no difference. There's no increase in vitamin D, which you might have expected, or antioxidants. There's no decrease. So they're exactly the same. Uh,
Sorry, why would you expect there to be an increase in vitamin D?
all right. So basically what happens is when you expose mushrooms to UV light, it basically activates the vitamin D synthetic pathway. So what you'll notice is some companies will expose their mushrooms to UV to boost the vitamin D and say, oh, look at this, vitamin D enriched. I know that's an issue with pets for the simple reason that you had this sort of case, wasn't it? It's outbreak, whatever you want to call it, where there was excess vitamin D added to the formula, and that was devastating to the animals and things like that. So basically, to get a processing aid designation, not only no residues, but no change in the nutrition. If we said, oh, we're boosting the vitamin D, that, for example, that would have said to you, oh, that's having an effect. That's a new additive then. So you have to declare the process, but it doesn't do anything like that. It's a very quick process, less than a few seconds, and it's on the surface. And so, as I say, things like kibble, things like raw pet food, they won't get affected by it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Well, I look forward to those subsequent studies, because it sounds to me like you're ready to try feeding these products to, at first, colony animals rather than client-owned animals, to look at its safety. And I think that is an important new path of research as well. But in terms of your path of research for the hydroxy radical process on feed and food, what are your future plans for research?
Well, a bit like our sort of ongoing sort of strategy, if you want to call it a strategy, I don't think it's called a strategy, is that we like to go where problems lie, go head into the storm. So, in terms of the hydroxy radical process, for example, we're doing a lot of work with hatcheries. So, hatchery egg, and I guess this is relevant to pet food. With hatchery eggs, they can be contaminated with salmonella, which then gets onto the chick, and the chick spreads it to the flock. It goes into the meat, and it goes into raw pet food, and off it goes. So, and other avian pathogens. So we've got that ongoing. We're certainly looking at vertical farming or indoor farming or greenhouse farming, whatever you want to call it, because this is a new emerging area where people aren't really sure, not sure what the food safety risks are. And we're doing research on looking at the risks involved in each point, because the reality is indoor farming certainly has had a few incidents themselves in terms of recalls and outbreaks. So we're developing the hydroxy radical process for that. We're getting into all kinds of things, going from low moisture foods like nuts and things like that. But I certainly think this pet food avenue is good, because obviously, again, there's a need for it. Good hygienic practice, good manufacturing practice isn't all you need. You need that decontamination step. As you rightly mentioned, though, you've got to think about how we're going to do this. And obviously, raw pet food isn't just chicken. It's lots of different things, from sardines to chicken finger, things like that. So we've got to validate the process there. And then once we've optimized, and when we say optimized, it really depends what you're looking at. If you're looking at a frozen product, then you want it to keep frozen. So you have to have a different processing or treatment condition as you would do for kibble. So you optimize those processes, then you get into the actual commercial application, which we always strive for. I think we try to always make research which is useful to industry in one way or the other. And in this case, as you rightly said, you'll look at the nutrition profile, so it could be collaborating with those, and the animal trials as well, because it's a vital thing. But so in that research area, what we try to do, as I mentioned, is rather than second guess the industry, we want the industry to come to us and say, yeah, this is the application, because no two applications are the same.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm a very strong advocate and collaborate closely with the pet food industry because I believe that we have a mutual interest and not a conflict of interest per se. So it's really important for us to solve these problems together. And indeed, when we look at things like educating our undergraduate students, we're looking for these opportunities to connect them with the industry really early and some experiential learning. And maybe one of them will be about this product and working with a raw pet food company in the future. So thank you for that.
For more than 20 years, BioOrigin manufactures high-quality yeast-based ingredients through a sustainable biotechnological process, guaranteeing full traceability from the crop to the bowl. Through specialization in the fermentation process, BioOrigin brings the right solution for specific nutritional, palatability, and health appeals, such as gut health, immune system, skin health, weight control, and more. BioOrigin's products are natural origin, non-GMO, and certified sustainable by Bonsucro. BioOrigin is your partner for high-quality, yeast-based ingredients to add value to pet foods worldwide. Learn more at bioorigin.net.
I do want to first ask if anybody who is listening would like to get in contact with you for either some advice about their food safety as it pertains to pet food or for future research opportunities. How can they get a hold of you?
Well, I'm always on email. Maybe you'll need email too much. And my email is kwrrine@uoguelph.ca, or you can just put Warriner Guelph and you'll see all the all the things go on. So they can certainly contact me with that. Obviously, the phone as well. I'm on the extension here, or just whatever, or come to see me on a conference. I'm attending the pet food show, and I hope to see a lot of people there. And I think one of the big things we focus on is to do outreach with industry. I know certain faculty, won't say which ones, refuse to talk to industry, but we're a bit opposite to that. And if you want to know more about the commercial hydroxyradical process, Cleanworks Limited, which is in Beamsville in Niagara. So Cleanworks in Beamsville, Paul Moyer or Denise Vanderveen, they're the kind of people who are application specialists. So they took the research and they've commercialized it. We're separate from them, obviously, but they're good if you want to see an application. So yes, and like I say, I'm always open to collaborations or even just helping out where I can.
Absolutely. And what Keith was alluding to is he is a speaker at this year's Pet Food Forum. And if you'd like to find him there, look for him in the program. And you can now see him on YouTube. So you can find him there if you'd like to have initial discussions with him at Pet Food Forum. So, Keith, I always like to end off with a couple of more philosophical questions. You and I, both as professors, are responsible for also training highly qualified personnel. What do you think, or what is one of your selection criteria when you're looking for graduate students?
That's a very good question. And I'm not going to say my approach is foolproof because I can tell you a few stories. But really, you don't look at the grade for a start. If you've got a 99% versus a 78%, I don't differentiate the two. What I look for is this self-motivation, this interest. And what you try to do, or I try to do also, is look to see, get them in the lab, see how they interact with the team, because you don't want to disrupt the team balance too much. But you can sense it. I think, I don't know if you feel the same. You first meeting, first impressions, you can get a sense saying, yeah, this is the person's interested and motivated, they want to learn. And that's the important thing. I know some come with 99% saying, oh, look at me, how good I am. But academically and research are two totally different disciplines, you're basically different. So I've had some very good students, and I could name some, but I'll embarrass them if I did. But they've been very good in terms of driving it forward, interact, and they found jobs in industry, some in academia. But yeah, if I had a selection criteria, then yeah, definitely it's to do with motivation, interest, and wanting to get things done. And oddly enough, I don't look for research experience per se, but I want to see what they've done, because coming back to my chef days, if anyone's like been a chef, for example, I know what they've been through. They've gone through a mill that's really toughened them up a bit. So yeah, that's my. But I have been wrong on a little few occasions, but yeah, that's what it is.
I would be very similar to you, Keith. I also, everything you said, I completely agree with a selection of graduate students. So now I want my very last question, because I'm just curious about this, because your background was as a chef. What is your most favorite dish to make? And it can't be something mundane like macaroni and cheese, which is my favorite, but is very mundane. What is your favorite dish to make as a chef and now as a food scientist?
That's a very good question. I was going to say mac and cheese, but you took that from me. Oddly enough, my favourite is always been spaghetti carbonara, because it's fun to make and it's fun to use and it's quick and easy. So typically I like making that when I can. I also like making the standard stuff as well, because like I say, I don't want to give people the impression I was at a Michelin star restaurant and doing things like that. These were kind of various ones, but certainly with cooking, it's very interesting how it's reminiscent of doing experiments. You've got to have the ingredients, you've got to do it right, and if you get one little thing wrong, it'll go. So it's quite interesting, the similarities to it, and also the workplace and but I must admit, what's very different is the atmosphere in a research group compared to a kitchen. And when you look at TV, you see things like Gordon Ramsay and things like that, and say, "Oh, that's just taken out of context. That's not real." It is. Honestly, all the kitchens I've been in are literally furnaces, and what they do is they toughen you up really quickly. And when you come into academia, it's almost like a little playground. I always looking at their little arguments and discussions, they would not survive a day in the kitchen. So to answer your question, then yeah, I like cooking when I can. Obviously, you don't get too much time to do it. Maybe when I retire, I'll go back to the kitchen and that. But yeah, you certainly like it is relaxing as well, as everyone found out during the pandemic. But yeah, it's a long time ago, to be honest. So it's going right back to the last time I was in a kitchen must have been in the 90s. Yeah, it was in the in the 80s. Yeah, in the 80s it was. Yeah, a long time ago.
Well, my son would like that very much. His favorite dish is carbonara.
Yeah, it's nice. Done right.
And it's very tasty, and frankly, it's got a good nutritional profile, so good choice.
Oh, there you go. I'll live forever.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for talking with us today, and I really look forward to seeing what you present at Pet Food Forum this coming May.
Thank you, Kate.